Today we'll be talking about Andrew Jackson's presidency and how it was a turning point in American history. Where is it falls?
He's a really cool guy.
Let's get jiggy with it.
Let's start at the beginning. Andrew Jackson was born March 15, 1767 on the border between North and South Carolina. Fun fact, he was born in a log cabin, which makes him the first president to be born in a log cabin. Sorry, Abe, you'll have to take the back seat on this one.
Now, grew up very poor, had very little schooling, which helped him relate to the masses later, and earned him the reputation of the common man.
These humble upbringings would lead him to join the military and have a successful career there, which would give him the persona of a war hero later on.
Now, this war hero was kind of inspired by his deep-seated hatred for the British. It started off when he was a young child, and his mother and two brothers were killed by the British. Now, he joined the Revolutionary Army at age 13 and fought the entirety of the war. He continued to stay in the Army and moved up the ranks until the War of 1812, where he had the rank of Major General.
Now, Jackson played a major role in the War of 1812 in the Southern Theater, but is mostly remembered for his victory at the Battle of New Orleans. This happened 2 weeks after the war had ended, though, and is mainly due to the fact that everyone back then had terrible cell reception.
Now, character trait that aided him in this military successes was his extremely pugnacious nature. In his life, he was involved in hundreds of duels. He also waged war on Indian tribes in Florida, and mainly out of racism. And even though he was never ordered to, he returned a hero.
Now, through all of these traits and experiences, his military career, pugnacious attitude, and frontier upbringing earned him the nickname Old Hickory. Yet another thing that helped him win the presidency. You know, if you think about it, most of our most famous presidents had nicknames, and this was yet another thing that helped make Jackson a common man.
So after the War of 1812, Old Hickory returned a national hero with a victorious military career. This legacy got him quickly nominated for president in the election of 1824.
Ba-ding bing bow!
Now, we'll take a small break to view a duel between Andrew Jackson and one of his many foes.
Go.
Drop!
One of the most important things about Jackson was his work in the nullification crisis.
That all started in 1828 when a tariff was passed to increase manufacturing in America by making foreign imports more expensive. This generally made Southerners angry due to the fact that they had put all their money into slaves and cotton and would have to pay more for the goods.
Tariff was nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations by angry Southerners, and none were more angered than those in South Carolina. So when the Tariff of 1832 came around, which actually lowered the tariff, the South Carolina legislature wanted to express their states' rights, attempting to argue the right that states could nullify something passed by the federal government.
This meant that basically South Carolina was going to ignore what they were saying and they weren't going to pay the tariff. And in response, Jackson passed the Force Act so he could use federal troops to collect the tax. This definitely didn't help his reputation of being a tyrant and a dictator. You know, soldiers forcing the collection of taxes and all.
All this was solved, though, when Congress passed the Compromise Tariff of 1833 that lowered the tariff and eased tensions all around. However, this whole dilemma was a prelude to the Civil War 30 years later.
But now it's time for the excerpted rebus.
So how this works is that I have to guess the title of the novel that the excerpt is from. If I get it wrong, I get Rock'em Sock'em. Here we go. Is this the quote that I have to read?
Yep.
John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. That's from a novel?
Yep.
Alright. Well, that's obviously Andrew Jackson talking about John Marshall's ruling in the Indian Removal Act. So it's Andrew Jackson's response to John Marshall's ruling in the Indian Removal Act? Ah! What? What do you mean it was the American conflict by Horace Greeley? How was I supposed to know that?
This quote describes one of the most controversial parts of Jackson's presidency, but it also represents the part where he extended his executive power the most.
Andrew Jackson hated Indians and played a big role in the Indian removal and forced relocation. His actions were so aggressive and horrible, in fact, that when historians describe his Indian policies, they use phrases like ethnic cleansing.
Shortly after becoming president, Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the government the ability to buy land from the Indians in the East and give in exchange for land in the West. However, much like the name implies, there was much more removal than anything else.
So in 1832, the Indians decided to sue the government. The case of Worcester v. Georgia went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Justice John Marshall ruled that the state of Georgia had no power in Cherokee tribal lands.
However, as we already know, Jackson did not respect this decision.
Now, as you may know, Jackson at times was bullied by citizens in the newly formed Whig Party, who called him names like stupid and ugly, and as is more commonly known, they called him King Andrew III. This name referred to Jackson's seemingly uncanny expansion of his power to enforce what he has enacted, as well as his expansion of the use of the presidential veto.
Jackson's enforcement was best shown in acts like the Indian Removal Act and the Force Act. However, Jackson received much scrutiny for these because most of his interactions were less diplomatic than they were forceful.
Now, Jackson used the Georgia crisis from earlier to pressure the Cherokee leaders into signing a removal treaty, totally ignoring the decision made by Marshall.
Even though over 15,000 Cherokee pleaded and protested with the government, their pleas were ignored as they were removed from their homeland.
7,000 troops enforced the removal and relocation of these Indians, and over 4 died in the process. This was named the Trail of Tears, referring to the much sadness and flowing of tears that was present on the trail. Over a quarter of all Indians that went on the trail died.
You know where people don't die? In banks that aren't being robbed. Speaking of banks, one of the other areas where Jackson both set precedent for and expanded the power of the executive office was in his actions against the Bank of the United States. These are why you can't open a savings account in one today.
Now, Jackson and his supporters saw the bank as a tool for the rich to get even richer and as something that they would use to oppress the common man, namely farmers who were in debt, who were also Jackson's main supporters. For this reason, he vehemently opposed it and sought at all costs to stop it.
An example of this was what we know as pet banks, where you would move money from the bank to smaller private banks, which were called pet banks, that were favorable to his supporters.
However, Jackson's opponents would then try to get this money from the banks back into the Bank of the U.S., leaving a bunch of money up in the air, and the Bank of the U.S., as well as the U.S. economy, in just kind of chaos. And this is one of the reasons that caused the recession of 1837, and generally overall made Jackson's fiscal policies a failure.
Now, all of these events have something in common. Jackson raising the executive power to a level never seen before in the federal government. Jackson vetoed anything he didn't like and went around Congress daring them to try and stop it.
With more support from the common people than any other president before, he could do whatever he pleased, and he did.
By vetoing and passing any bill as he saw fit, Jackson greatly extended the executive powers, shaping them into what they are today.
So all the things are great and all, but you're probably wondering, how is this a turning point in American history? But it's really more obvious if you look at the big picture.
First off, Jackson prevented the Civil War from happening in 1830, and even though this never solved the problems of slavery and the extent of states' rights and the ways in which he handled the situations greatly expanded the powers of the executive office, and started a trend of doing so for really the rest of American history.
Also, the perception of the government as a whole was changed. Not only did it become a more powerful force whose words were followed by action, but it was an institution that was for the common man, that could really be run by the common man.
And that really is what democracy is, isn't it? Then and now. Thanks for watching, guys.